The evening had been set to impress the city's elite. Expensive cars lined the driveway of the billionaire family's mansion, their guests arriving in tailored suits and glittering gowns. Waiters moved gracefully through the crowd with trays of champagne. Chandeliers sparkled above, and laughter rose from every corner of the hall. In the center of it all stood the family, dressed like royalty, smiling as if they owned not just the mansion, but the world itself. Every powerful business figure seemed to be there, and all eyes turned whenever the family made the slightest move. Into this dazzling display of wealth and arrogance walked a woman who carried herself with quiet confidence. She was the CEO of a rising company, one that had grown from a modest startup into a global brand. Her success was no accident. Every step she took had been fought for, earned through years of struggle. Yet in that room filled with polished marble and gold, the atmosphere shifted the moment she entered. Whispers started before she even reached the grand staircase. Some people nudged each other, some raised eyebrows, and a few simply stared. It was not her beauty which was striking, nor the elegance of her dark evening dress. It was something else. An unspoken disbelief that she belonged in this room of billionaires, as if her presence was a disruption to their perfect picture. She noticed the glances, but did not let them shake her. She kept her chin high and her stride steady, her expression calm, almost unreadable. The family's matriarch was the first to greet her, though the word greet hardly fit. With a smile too polished to be real, she looked her up and down before saying loudly enough for others to hear, "Well, I suppose you've made quite the entrance. I didn't expect such a bold choice of dress." Some nearby guests chuckled, under their breath pretending to sip their drinks. The CEO smiled politely, thanked her for the invitation, and walked further into the room, her heels clicking softly against the marble floor. Inside, she felt a sting of humiliation. It was not the first time someone had tried to make her feel small, and it would not be the last. As the evening carried on, the comments grew bolder. At the long dinner table, one of the family's sons leaned across the silverware and crystal glasses to ask in a mocking tone, "Are you sure you're the CEO? You sound more like the assistant." No offense, of course. He laughed before taking a sip of his wine as if his words were a harmless joke. The people around him forced awkward smiles, unwilling to challenge him, unwilling to risk their own standing. The CEO's hand rested lightly on her fork, steady as stone, though her heart tightened in her chest. She knew the game they were playing. She knew they believed their wealth and privilege gave them the right to humiliate others. Every insult was like a camera flash, bright, sharp, impossible to ignore. Someone whispered that she was ambitious for her kind. Another asked if her company's rise had been luck rather than skill. At one point, she overheard the patriarch himself tell an investor that working with her was charitable, a gesture of inclusivity more than business. His words stung, but she gave no reaction. Instead, she let their arrogance wash over her, silent but not defeated. For what they could not see was that she was not at their mercy. The very project they toasted so confidently depended entirely on her decision. She glanced around the table, watching the guests laugh at stories about yachts, vacations, and exclusive clubs. Not a single person asked her about her company, her vision, or the journey that had brought her here. To them, she was an outsider at best, a token at worst. But she knew her worth, and she knew her story was not one of privilege, but of perseverance. She had built her company without a family fortune, without safety nets or second chances. She had faced rejection after rejection, yet had stood up every time, stronger than before. Sitting in that lavish dining hall, with its golden chandeliers and velvet curtains, she realized that nothing about her path resembled theirs, and that was her strength. The waiters moved around them with plates of delicate dishes, but the CEO barely noticed. Her thoughts wandered back to the small office where she had started with a handful of employees and second-hand desks. She remembered the long nights when she worked until sunrise, her eyes heavy but her determination stronger than her exhaustion. She remembered the days when investors refused to hear her ideas, when banks closed their doors before she could even finish her pitch. Each rejection had been a bruise, but never a defeat. And now those very same investors who once ignored her were seated around this table, too eager to laugh at the host's jokes to remember that she had already proven them all wrong. The billionaire. Family, however, was blind to her strength. They carried on with their arrogance, convinced they were the only ones who mattered in the room. One of the daughters leaned close to her and whispered with a smirk, "You should enjoy this dinner. While it lasts, not everyone gets invited twice." The words were meant to sting, to remind her of her supposed place. She simply smiled, her eyes calm, her voice steady as she replied, "I assure you, once is more than enough." The daughter blinked, not expecting such composure. The night dragged on, the laughter of the powerful filling every corner of the mansion. Yet beneath the surface, an unspoken tension grew. The guests were waiting for her to speak, to confirm the partnership, to put her name beside the billionaire families and seal a deal worth $900 million. But she remained quiet, letting their arrogance echo, letting them believe. She had no choice. Inside, however, her decision was already made. She had come here not just to sign papers, but to see for herself whether this family deserved to walk beside her company's name. And every cruel laugh, every whispered insult, every shallow toast had given her the answer. She knew now that no amount of money could buy respect, and without respect, there was no deal. When the patriarch finally raised his glass and called for a toast, everyone turned to her, expecting her to smile, to nod, to join in. Instead, she lifted her glass slowly, her expression unreadable, her silence louder than their laughter. They thought she was hesitant. They thought she was nervous. They thought they had humiliated her into submission. What they did not realize was that she was preparing to do the one thing no one at that table could imagine. As she sat at that long, polished table, pretending to listen to the meaningless chatter of the rich, her mind wandered back to the very beginning of her journey. It was strange, she thought, how quickly people judged her without ever knowing what it had taken for her to sit in that chair. They looked at her and saw only what they wanted to see, a woman who didn't belong. But if they had known her story, if they had seen the nights she spent building her dream with nothing but hope and sheer determination, they might have thought twice before laughing. She remembered being a little girl in a small neighborhood, where opportunity rarely knocked. Her parents had worked long hours, her mother as a nurse, her father at a factory, doing everything they could to keep food on the table. There were nights when the electricity bill wasn't paid on time, and the only light in the house came from candles on the kitchen table. She had sat under that dim glow, books open, studying as if the world depended on it. Teachers would sometimes glance at her with pity, telling her she was smart but also warning her that life might not give her many chances. Those words had never discouraged her. They had fueled her. As she grew older, she faced barriers that others didn't. When she tried to apply for scholarships, some people suggested she lower her goals, to aim smaller, to not dream so big. When she walked into her first bank to request a loan for a small business idea, the manager barely looked at her papers before shaking his head. "Too risky," he said, though she noticed the man after her, a young entrepreneur with the right connections, was approved within minutes. She left that bank with her head held high, though inside her heart felt like stone. Still, she didn't stop. Years later, she finally managed to launch her company. It was nothing fancy at first, a small rented office with second-hand chairs, a few computers that froze more than they worked, and a handful of employees who believed in her vision. She remembered the first week clearly. The phones hardly rang. Bills piled up. Her staff worried about their paychecks. More than once she considered giving up. But each time she stood in front of her team and reminded them, "We are not here to prove the world right. We are here to prove them wrong." And slowly things began to change. Her company grew because she worked harder than anyone else. While others slept, she was awake making calls, sending emails, studying contracts word by word. While others spent weekends on beaches or in the comfort of country clubs, she was in that tiny office, building a foundation brick by brick. She earned clients not through favors or family ties, but because she delivered results no one else could. People started to notice. Her name began to appear in articles, her company on lists of fastest-growing businesses. But even then, the respect she deserved was never given freely. There were always whispers, always questions, always a shadow of doubt hanging over her success. Now, sitting in the mansion of a family who believed their wealth made them superior, she felt that same doubt being cast again, not because she hadn't proven herself, but because some people could never accept that power could belong to someone like her. Their arrogance was a mirror of every rejection she had faced before, and instead of breaking her, it only reminded her of how far she had come. The room was alive with chatter and laughter, but she drifted deeper into memory. She remembered the time she lost her biggest client early on, when she thought her company would collapse before it had truly begun. She cried that night, not out of weakness but out of exhaustion. Then she stood up, wiped her tears, and began making calls at midnight, refusing to accept defeat. By morning, she had found new leads, and within a month, she had signed a deal even larger than the one she lost. That was the rhythm of her life. Loss followed by comeback, rejection followed by triumph. What struck her most in these memories was not the pain, but the resilience it created. She realized that every no she had ever heard was just another step toward the yes that truly mattered. She realized that the mansion she was sitting in now was nothing compared to the empire she had built with her own hands. The family may have laughed at her tonight, but they could never erase the story that had shaped her. Her thoughts returned to the present as one of the guests leaned toward her and asked in a patronizing tone, "Tell us, how did you even get started? Who backed you?" She almost laughed at the question. They couldn't imagine someone rising without a billionaire behind them, without an old family name, without a safety net of inherited wealth. She looked at the man calmly and said, "I backed myself." The table went quiet for a moment. Some people smiled politely, some raised their eyebrows, but she knew the truth of her words. It was not just confidence, it was reality. As she sat back, she felt a calm strength settling over her. The more they spoke down to her, the clearer her decision became. This deal was never going to be about money. $900 million might have dazzled anyone else, but she had already learned that wealth without respect was hollow. She had lived poor and still found dignity. She had lived with little and still found power. She would not trade her self-respect for their approval. At that moment, her memory drifted again to her parents. She could almost hear her father's voice telling her, "They will underestimate you. Let them. Then show them who you really are." She could picture her mother, working night shifts but still smiling at breakfast, reminding her to stand tall no matter who tried to push her down. She realized that the strength she carried now was not just her own. It was the legacy of every struggle, every lesson, every person who had believed in her when the world did not. Back at the table, the family continued their laughter, their jokes, their arrogance. They thought she was quiet because she was intimidated. They thought her silence was surrender. But inside, she was no longer hurt by their words. She was focused, centered, waiting for the moment when she would show them the truth. The night might have belonged to them, but the future did not. And as she sat surrounded by chandeliers and false smiles, she understood something that made her stronger than ever. She had nothing left to prove, and everything left to choose. The night carried on with the kind of arrogance only extreme wealth can create. The billionaire family moved around the table like actors on a stage, each word rehearsed, each laugh louder than the last, as if they wanted to remind the world of their power. To them, she was not a partner, not an equal, but a guest to be tolerated, a box checked for appearances. They believed her success was a fluke, a lucky accident, and tonight they wanted to make sure she remembered that. One of the sons leaned back in his chair, swirling his glass of wine. His voice was sharp enough for half the room to hear. "It's funny, isn't it? In our world, people forget their place so easily, but at least we can still choose who sits at our table." He didn't look at her directly, but the smirk on his face left no doubt whom he meant. The people nearby chuckled politely, some out of habit, others out of fear. The CEO sat still, her expression calm, her eyes steady. If there was one thing she had learned through the years, it was that silence often carried more weight than anger. But silence did not mean weakness. Inside her mind, she was already shaping her decision. Every arrogant laugh, every careless remark was another nail in the coffin of their partnership. They thought they were humiliating her, but in reality they were closing the door on the very deal they so proudly boasted about. The patriarch rose from his chair to deliver a story. He spoke about the family's legacy, their history of success, their ability to shape entire industries with a single investment. He talked about power as if it were their birthright. Then, in the middle of his speech, he gestured toward her and said, "And now, even outsiders can share in our greatness." The word outsider struck the room like a match against dry wood. Some people looked down, uncomfortable, while others nodded as if it were nothing more than truth. She sat perfectly still, though her heart pounded in her chest. Outwardly, she was calm, composed, a mask of serenity. Inwardly, however, she felt the same fire that had carried her through years of struggle. She thought of the sacrifices she had made, of the countless hours when she had been underestimated, ignored, dismissed. And now, here she was, not as an outsider begging to be included, but as the key to a project they desperately needed. If only they could see the irony. Across the table, an older investor leaned toward her with curiosity. His voice was softer, more genuine. "I've followed your company's growth," he said quietly. "Remarkable work, truly remarkable." Looked at him and gave a small smile. It wasn't much, but it was the first acknowledgement of her worth that evening. Yet before she could respond, the billionaire daughter interrupted with a laugh, saying, "Remarkable, yes, but let's be honest. The project wouldn't be half as interesting without our name attached to it." The room laughed with her. The investor leaned back, silenced, his words swept away by the tide of arrogance. The CEO's gaze drifted across the room. She noticed the way the waiters avoided eye contact, as if they too felt the sting of the family's cruelty. She noticed the nervous smiles of other guests torn between amusement and discomfort, and then she realized something. The family wasn't just humiliating her. They humiliated everyone they believed was beneath them. That was their way of holding power, not through respect, but through fear and shame. And yet, she was not afraid. She was not ashamed. She knew something none of them seemed to understand. Without her signature, their grand project, this $900 million venture they had toasted so loudly, was nothing but a fantasy. And she was ready to remind them of that truth in a way they would never forget. For now, though, she let them talk. She let them boast about their yachts, their vacations, their art collections. She listened as they bragged about crushing smaller competitors, buying out companies just to destroy them. The more they spoke, the clearer it became. This deal wasn't just about business, it was about aligning her company's name with theirs. And she realized with absolute certainty that no sum of money could make that worthwhile. The night reached a peak when the matriarch raised her glass and said, "A toast to our family's continued legacy and to the new partners who will rise under our guidance." Her words dripped with condescension, as if she were granting favors rather than forming partnerships. Glasses clinked all around, laughter filled the air, and once again all eyes turned toward the CEO. She lifted her glass slowly, her expression unreadable. She didn't drink, not yet. She simply let the silence stretch, her gaze steady, her smile faint but deliberate. People shifted, uncomfortably in their seats. They thought she was nervous, they thought she was overwhelmed. What they didn't know was that she was savoring the moment, letting them believe they were in control, when in truth the entire night was moving toward a decision only she could make. One of the sons leaned closer, lowering his voice but not enough to hide his sneer. "Don't worry," he whispered. "Once the deal is signed, you'll learn how things work around here." She turned her head slowly, meeting his eyes, and for the first time that evening, she let her smile sharpen, just enough to unsettle him. "I already know how things work," she said softly, "and I also know when to walk away." He blinked, confused, but before he could respond, She returned her gaze to the center of the table, leaving him rattled. The confidence in her voice had been quiet, but it carried a power no amount of arrogance could match. Around her, the family laughed louder, poured more wine, told more stories. They didn't realize it yet, but the fate of their carefully planned empire had shifted in that moment. While they believed they were winning, she was already preparing to end the game. The night would not end with humiliation. It would end with a decision that would echo far beyond the walls of this mansion. And when the time came, every person at that table would understand a truth they had ignored for too long. Respect cannot be bought and dignity cannot be mocked away. The evening had stretched long into the night. The ballroom was filled with golden light, the clinking of crystal glasses, the low hum of conversations that seemed endless. To the guests, it was just another evening of wealth and power, another reminder of their own importance. But to her, each passing minute was another test of patience, another layer of arrogance she allowed them to pile higher and higher until it would all come crashing down. The patriarch finally stood again, his voice carrying across the polished room. He spoke of legacy, of family honor, of the billions already under their control. He gestured toward the contracts lying neatly on a nearby table, as if they were nothing more than paperwork to be signed and forgotten. Tonight marks the beginning of something historic, he announced proudly. A partnership that will shape industries, create wealth beyond imagination, and prove once again that our family leads the way. Applause followed, some polite, some genuine, but all directed toward the family. She sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap, her face calm, her expression unreadable. The spotlight wasn't on her yet, but she knew it soon would be. Then came the matriarch, raising her glass high, her voice sharp but sweet like poisoned honey. "Let us toast to our new partner," she declared, her eyes flicking toward the CEO. "For in our generosity we have welcomed her into our circle, and we know she will rise higher with our guidance." The words were wrapped in elegance but heavy with insult. It was not a partnership she described, but charity. It was not respect she offered, but control. The room turned toward the CEO, waiting for her to stand, to smile, to thank them for the honor of being welcomed. Guests leaned forward slightly, some with genuine curiosity, others with the quiet hunger of gossip, eager to see if the rumors were true, that the deal was as good as sealed. She rose slowly, her movements graceful, deliberate. The sound of her chair sliding back echoed faintly in the sudden hush. She picked up her glass, the crystal glinting in the chandelier's glow, and for a long moment, she simply stood there scanning the room, her gaze calm and steady. Every eye was on her now. Every laugh had faded into silence. She could almost hear the anticipation thick and heavy in the air. Finally, she spoke. Her voice was clear, not loud, but strong enough to reach every corner of the hall. "I want to thank you for inviting me tonight. I want to thank you for showing me who you are." A ripple of confusion moved across the room. Some guests shifted uncomfortably. The matriarch's smile faltered for the first time. She continued, her tone calm but cutting through the silence like a blade. "Respect cannot be given with money. Respect cannot be wrapped in false smiles or hidden behind jokes at someone else's expense. I did not come here to be welcomed. I came here to see if this partnership was worthy of my company, my employees, and the people who have believed in me from the very beginning." Whispers stirred at the edges of the room, but she did not pause. "And tonight, you have shown me everything I needed to see. You have shown me that wealth without humility is arrogance. You have shown me that power without respect is weakness, and you have shown me that my company deserves far better than this." The patriarch's face stiffened, his jaw tightening as he tried to maintain composure. "Surely," he said with a forced chuckle, "you don't mean—" But she raised her hand slightly, silencing him without raising her voice. "There will be no deal," she said simply. Her words fell into the room like thunder, quiet but devastating. Gasps filled the air. Some guests turned to each other in disbelief. Others stared at her, wide-eyed, as if they had just witnessed something impossible. The family laughed at first, convinced it was a bluff, a performance meant to sting before she inevitably signed. "You're emotional," the matriarch said sharply. "You'll reconsider in the morning." But the CEO's calm smile never wavered. She reached for the unsigned contract on the table, held it in her hands for a moment, and then placed it back neatly. "No reconsideration," she replied. "Not now, not tomorrow, not ever. I would rather walk away with nothing than sell my company's name to people who see dignity as a weakness and arrogance as strength." The silence that followed was unlike any the family had ever faced in their own home. For the first time, they were not in control of the room. For the first time, their power did not silence opposition but expose their emptiness. Around the room, some guests lowered their glasses, ashamed to have laughed earlier. A few investors looked at her with newfound respect, recognizing courage when they saw it. And though the family stood frozen in disbelief, she knew the decision was already sealed. She placed her glass down gently, not a drop spilled, and gathered her things with the same grace she had carried all evening. Her every movement was calm, deliberate, as if the humiliation they had tried to inflict had never touched her. And in truth, it hadn't, not in the way they hoped. Because humiliation only works when someone accepts it, and she never had. Before she turned to leave, she looked once more at the family. Her voice was quiet, but it carried through the hall like a final verdict. "Money can buy many things," she said, "but it cannot buy respect. And without respect, you have nothing worth selling." And with that, she walked out, her heels clicking against the marble floor, each step louder than their laughter, louder than their legacy, louder than their pride. The doors closed behind her, leaving the family in stunned silence, their empire suddenly smaller, their wealth suddenly meaningless. That night, she did not just cancel a deal. She made a statement that would echo far beyond that mansion, a statement that would remind the world that dignity has no price tag. The night had ended with her footsteps echoing out of that mansion, but the story was only beginning. By morning, news of what had happened spread faster than wildfire. At first, it was whispers. Guests who had attended the dinner calling their friends, investors sending quiet messages, assistants gossiping behind closed doors. But within hours, the headlines arrived. CEO walks away from $900 million deal. Billionaire family humiliated after public snub. Respect over money. A woman's stand shakes the business world. Her phone lit up nonstop. Reporters wanted statements. Investors wanted explanations. Strangers sent messages of admiration, calling her brave, calling her inspiring. She didn't rush to respond. She didn't need to. Her silence spoke louder than anything she could have said. The world had already seen the truth. She had turned her back on almost $1 billion, not because she couldn't have it, but because she refused to pay the price of dignity. Meanwhile, the billionaire family faced something they had never encountered before: public shame. Their arrogance, which had seemed untouchable within the walls of their mansion, was now exposed to the world. Videos from the evening leaked online. Guests who had laughed awkwardly at the cruel jokes now shifted blame, claiming they had never agreed with the family's treatment of her. People dissected every photo, every clip, pointing out the sneers, the dismissive gestures, the smug comments. What the family thought would be a victory dinner became a public disaster. For the CEO, the days that followed were surreal. She went about her work as usual, arriving early to the office, greeting her team, checking on projects. Her employees watched her with a mixture of pride and awe. They knew what she had done. They knew the kind of courage it took to say no when the world expected you to say yes. She gathered them in the conference room and told them simply, "We don't need their money. We don't need their approval. We have everything we need right here." The room erupted in applause, not the polite kind, but the raw, heartfelt kind that comes when people believe in the leader standing before them. The investors who had sat silent at the mansion began reaching out one by one. They spoke of new opportunities, of wanting to partner in the future. Some even apologized for not speaking up when they should have. She listened politely, but she remembered who had been silent. She remembered who had laughed. Trust, once broken, was Not easily repaired. She didn't need them now. She never really had. On social media, her name became a rallying cry. Young entrepreneurs posted about her saying she gave them hope. Women shared her story as proof that strength wasn't about fitting in but about standing firm. People from all walks of life quoted her words. Money can buy many things, but it cannot buy respect. It was repeated in classrooms, in boardrooms, in casual conversations across the globe. She had not set out to become a symbol, but that's exactly what she became. The Billionaire family tried damage control. They released statements about misunderstandings and taken out of context moments. They hosted charity events hoping to repair their image, but it was too late. Their name, once untouchable, now carried the shadow of arrogance. For the first time, people were no longer impressed by their wealth. They were embarrassed by it. Their empire would continue, but their legacy had been stained in a way money could never wash clean. For her, however, the decision brought peace. She had nothing to regret. That $900 million would have grown her company faster. Yes, but it would have cost her soul, and she knew that without dignity, no amount of success was truly success. She sat in her office one evening long after her staff had left, watching the city lights twinkle outside. She thought of her parents, of the sacrifices they had made. She thought of her younger self, studying under candlelight, dreaming of a future that seemed impossible. And she smiled, because she had become the person that little girl had always hoped to be, someone who stood tall no matter how heavy the world tried to press her down. Weeks later, she was invited to speak at a global conference. Thousands filled the hall, millions watched online. She stood on the stage, calm and steady, just as she had stood in that mansion weeks before. This time, however, there was no arrogance in the air, no cruel laughter. There was respect, real, undeniable respect. She told her story, not with bitterness but with truth. She spoke about the importance of building not just companies but values. She reminded them that leadership was not about money or power, but about integrity. When she finished, the room rose in a standing ovation that lasted long after she stepped away from the podium. The Billionaire family, though still wealthy, faded quietly from the center stage of influence. Their arrogance had cost them not just one deal, but their reputation in circles where reputation mattered most. The CEO never mentioned their name again. She didn't need to. The story was no longer about them. It was about her, and about everyone who had ever been underestimated, doubted, or dismissed. And so the deal that never happened became her greatest victory. Not because of what she lost, but because of what she refused to lose. She walked away from $900 million, but she walked into something far greater: her dignity, her respect, and a legacy that would inspire generations. That night, in the mansion had begun with humiliation, but in the end, she was the one who walked out taller, stronger, and unforgettable. And the world, watching closely, learned a lesson it would not soon forget. True power is not measured in wealth, but in the courage to say no when others expect you to bow.